Okay, now seems like there's one other family that we haven't talked about, which is a very interesting story, and that's the interesting story about this guy, and his name is Thomas, and his name is Cosimo Thomas. Now, Cosimo Thomas isn't Cosmo Tommaso; it's Cosmo Thomas, and Cosmo was a pretty affluent guy in a town called Valle Rotondo, and Valle Rotondo is in Italy.
North or
And
south?
he is in southern Italy, and actually, he was a very he was a pretty he was considered aristocratic. Meanwhile, in a town nearby, there was a guy named Gianmarco who was pretty it was almost considered. My grandmother used to call him a baron, but this Gianmarco guy was a pretty highfalutin, very wealthy guy who lived in this town called Avanzano. Now, Gianmarco educated his children. The children could read. They were sophisticated, and they were a very well-off family in this little village in this town called Avanzano. And he had some children, and one of his daughters was named as Giuseppina. Now, Giuseppina was quite a looker. It's a good-looking girl. She was wealthy.
Thomas.
You know, the name was Giuseppina Gianmarco.
That was his daughter.
That's Gianmarco's daughter, right? Cosmo Thomas, the other guy from Mala Rotunda, he had a son who was available. Now, we try to figure out what his son did for his living, and the best we can figure out, his name was Don Perino, and we think he was a poet. We're not sure exactly what he did for a living, but he came from highfalutin standards.
Okay.
And he had a lot of wealth. So now you got Cosmo.
Confused. So there's Cosmo Thomas.
Cosmo that lives in Valle Rotondo.
Okay, he had a son.
And his oldest son is Pierino.
Is Perino.
Right.
Who's a poet.
Who we think is a poet.
So Perino Thomas.
Perino Thomas.
And now who's this other family? Let's say
the other guy lives in Avanzano.
Avanzano.
And his name is Gianmarco. I'll tell you what his first name is in a second. Vincent, I think. Yeah, Vincent Gianmarco. And he had a whole bunch of kids. But one of his kids he had 4 kids, and he had Vinny, Eddie, Maria, and Giuseppina. But Giuseppina was a real looker, right? Giuseppina was lovely. She liked men.
Was this in
men
the same
liked
town?
her. What?
Was this in the same town?
This is in a town called Avanzano.
Well, are they close?
Not really, but they're in the same neighborhood. So, but don't forget, if you give your daughter, you have to give. If you wanted your daughter, your daughter would marry who you said you would marry.
Yeah.
And Vincent Gianmarco was sure his daughter was going to marry someone who was affluent as they are. So he heard about Don Perino, who was the son of Don Cosmo from Valle Rotondo, and their last name was Thomas. They wasn't Tommaso. They were Thomas because apparently the southern part of Italy was invaded by the Normans many centuries ago. They came down. The Normans were in England, and they invaded Sicily in southern Italy, and they took over. And we think that one of them was a guy named Thomas that came from England. Could have been related to one of Michael's relatives. You never know.
Weird.
I was telling you the story. Michael Troughton.
Yeah.
So anyhow, one of those English guys came over, and they took over southern Italy, and there was a Norman invasion of southern Italy, which they were for a while. And we think that Thomas is probably one of their people. We're talking now centuries. This happened about 1500 or so, the Norman invasion, and we're talking about 1900, where this guy Cosmo Thomas and his son Perino were very affluent people. So when Gianmarco saw that, when Vincent Gianmarco was your son, my daughter makes a good couple, and they were going to we'll put them up together, we'll have ourselves a nice marriage, and we'll have a lot of royal kids to come from this relationship. Except that Mrs. Giuseppina, I said, was a looker, and this is the way she looked.
Might go back to any of the light. And who's that on the right?
That's Perino, the poet. Like his mustache?
I do.
So, but Giuseppina was a little headstrong. She liked men that were from her village, not this guy from some other village who was highfalutin and had a mustache. And she really liked this guy who was running a drugstore, called him the pharmacist. We don't know who the pharmacist was. But we know there was a pharmacist. And Giuseppina would pine over him. So much so she'd write she had the gift of language, she had the gift of pen, she was very educated and very intelligent. And she liked romance. She particularly liked something called the Divine Comedy, which is it was 3 stories written by Dante about how this guy named this lady named Beatrice is the most beautiful woman in the world. Now Dante would go to all ends of the world for her love.
How do you know this?
I know the story.
Well, how do you...
And because he wrote the story about the 9 levels of heaven, and up at the 9th level of heaven was the Virgin Mary and Beatrice up there in the 9th. And then he wrote the Inferno, which was the 9 levels of hell. And who was down on the 9th level of hell? Well, there was Judas, there was the devil, and there was this guy that Beatrice was going out with at the time. So it was a very beautiful story, very exuberant story about love and how this guy absolutely loved out of his mind Beatrice. You may say the name is Beatrice, but it's actually Beatrice. Okay?
Okay.
So anyhow, so she was in love with the pharmacist. And her father says, "What? No, you're not going to marry any pharmacist. What do you think you are? You are special, and we are going to get you involved with a special guy, and we're going to have a special marriage, and you're going to marry Don Cosmo's son, Don Perino, the poet." And she says, "No, I'm not." And he goes, "Yes, you are. Why? Because I'm your father, and a girl has to do what her father says." Well, what would you do if you were her? She goes sees her mother, right? And she goes sees her mother, whose name was Victoria de Falco. And her mother says, "Suck it in. You gotta marry him. Those are the rules." So she married him, and she was miserable. But she married him. But when Perino was writing his poems, guess what Giuseppina did? She sneak out the back and go to the drugstore and hung out with a pharmacist. Right? So Don Perino's saying, "What's going on? You're my wife. You are to stay home." She says, "Sure, no problem." Next day, where's his wife? She's at the drugstore. "I got a headache." She's going to go see the pharmacist, right? So finally he said, enough of this. You're not going to go see the pharmacist anymore. And she says, I'll see who I want to see. So he says, okay. So Don Perino went to his father and says, "I have some friends over in America. And you might do better, you might be happy over there. And you do better here because there may not be jobs for retired poets. You're going to have to support a family. So you go to the United States and you find somebody." So he came in and he said to his wife, Giuseppina, that's this one, "We are going to the United States. They have money on the ground. We'll pick it up. We're going to have a wonderful time there. There's lots of Italian people there, and we're going to settle in the United States." She goes, "What? We live in here in Avezzano. We got a nice house, and we're going to have a family on the way. First son's coming along here pretty soon."
What year is this?
This is about 1914, 19, around that time, right? 1915, right? So she says, "I don't want to go." And she says, "You have to go. We're going with the whole family." So they get in the car. They get in the boat, and they all come over to this country. You know,
What? So
him and his
they
wife,
miss the earthquake,
and their little
or?
Boy Silvio, and then they come in here, right?
Did they miss the earthquake?
I'm telling you a story.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Right? So they're in the country, and they move here. And sure enough, where do they end up? On Federal Hill. And she's looking around and says, "I thought we were going to move to a palace here. What happened to the palace?" And he goes, "Well, this is very nice. There's all these Italian people." So they got a house on Federal Hill, which right now is where Route 95 is. You know where the pine cone is? Their house was over there. And he says, "We're going to open a store, and I'm going to do a cigar store, and we're going to sell cigars." And she says, what? And she's looking around there, and these are poor people. I am special, right? So she's trying to convince him how special she is, and then deep down inside, she didn't want to be married to him in the first place, and then deep down inside that she really has had this idea of this pharmacist back in Avanzano. So then one morning they wake up and everybody's buzzing in the hill. Why? Because there's a big earthquake back home, right? And what had happened? That the word is the people on the mountain were looking down, and they saw the earth open up, and the town of Avanzano fell down to earth, and the earth buried it over. Everybody in Avanzano was killed. Everybody. Her mother, Victoria, the one who said, "Oh, marry him." Her father, the one with all the money, wanted his daughter to marry a rich person. Her brothers, her sister, all gone. The pharmacist, gone. She had been complaining how I'm going to take my kid and I'm going to go back to Italy, and now she has no place to go back to. She has no family. Her friends are all dead. Her family's all dead.
Her money's all gone.
Her money's all gone. All she has is here. She's stuck. And she's selling cigars on Federal Hill. So, now what happens? Well, she has some kids. And the first kid's name is Silvio. Nice guy, Silvio. Second daughter's name is Filomeno. Third daughter is Ada. And then there's Vinny. And then there is, who else? There's Vinny, there's Ada, there's Philly, there's Silvio. Who am I leaving out? Oh yeah, and there's Eddie. Little Eddie. Little Eddie. So, what happens with them? So they raise a family. And her daughter goes to school, but her daughter's not really a very heavy-duty student. And she tries to teach her, and she does a good job, but her daughter's into playing and enjoying herself and having a good day. And this daughter's name is Filomena. She's cute, she's fun, and she's headstrong as her mother. Right? So headstrong, she gets a job, working in a jewelry factory. School wasn't right for her. And she meets this handsome, red-haired kid who's working in the factory as well. He is gorgeous.
Red-haired.
Red hair, looking like a god. And she instantly fell in love with him. Right? And she fell in love with him, and they just were nuts about each other. So she got home and told her mother. I said, "Mom, there's this cute guy named Tony. He comes from Roccamovina, and he's working down the factory with me, and I really like him a lot." And her mother, crazy thing, says, "Well, you can't marry him. He comes from nothing. He's a poor person. What's their family's blacksmiths? You gotta marry someone special. You're Giuseppina's daughter. You gotta marry someone who's a poet." Meanwhile, Perino's selling his cigars, having fun downstairs in the shop, and wife's working in the shop. And Perino says, "I don't care. Do whatever you want. I'm having a great time here. Give me another Sambuca or something. Give me another glass of wine." So what do you think Philly does? She says, "Tony, I love you, and I want to get married." And Tony says, "Anything you want, honey. I'm there. I'm there." Tony looked like this. Good-looking, red-haired guy.
And that's Filomena.
And this is Filomena here. So you know what they did?
Red hair, Italian, eh?
Right there, yeah. So guess what they do?
They run off and get married.
They ran off and get married. They eloped. No church, no priest. I don't know if they get married in the church or not, but they didn't get married in any church in Rhode Island. And they left town.
They left town?
Right.
Where?
And they went to Boston. And they got married in Boston. They took the train. They came back. And they both started working. They put their apartment. What? I didn't even get invited. My daughter, the daughter of Giuseppino Gianmarco, got married, and to this nothing, this zero. I'm not talking to them at all. I'm not even going to talk to them. So Philomena got settled, and she got her job, and Tony got settled, and he got his job, and they're working away. And before you know it, Philomena finds out she's going to have a baby. Right? So she's having this baby, and she's doing well, but the pregnancy's pretty stormy pregnancy. She's not feeling well during the pregnancy. She's a young woman. She's having some trouble. And what happened was, she didn't get a lot of health care because they didn't have any money then. And her mother would have nothing to do with it. And the only reason her mother found out she was pregnant at all, because her brother Vinny used to come over to visit her and get food out of her kitchen. And Vinny and her used to talk, and then Vinny used to go back and tell his mother what Philomena was doing. Right? Vinny was always that kind of guy. When I grew up, Vinny was living upstairs from me. And he was always the kind of guy that would like to stir up trouble. He ended up dying. And nobody knew where he was. And somebody finally found him and identified him.
Where was he?
But California did.
What? How did he disappear?
I'll tell you about that later.
Okay.
So anyhow, Vinny is telling what's going on. Philomena gets really sick, and she's having trouble, and they bring her to the hospital, and Tony doesn't know what to do. What's he, like 18 years old, working in a factory, and didn't have a pot to pee in, and his wife's in the hospital, and the doctor says she's very sick. She's got something called toxemia. Toxemia means that the blood pressure is so high that they're going to have seizures. The patient has seizures, and they pee out protein in their urine, and they get very sick. And sure enough, Philomena was very sick. So sick that they brought her to the labor room and tried to induce the labor. It's too soon, though. The baby wasn't ready yet. But if they didn't take the baby, then Philomena would die, and the baby would die. She was screaming in pain. They knocked her out, so she fell asleep. And they gave her some medicine, and they induced labor, and she gave birth to a baby. When she was not awake when she gave birth to the baby. She had no recollection of giving birth to the baby. Her husband is standing out there in the waiting room, not knowing what's going on, and the doctor's telling him his wife and his baby are going to die because her blood pressure's too high. Well, they delivered the baby, and the baby actually survived, but the baby was too young and had trouble breathing. They had to give the baby some oxygen. The mother, after the mother gave birth, like all mothers, the eclampsia went away. The blood pressure went away. They woke up, and the blood pressure went back down to normal. Right? And the mother says, okay, where's the baby? Is the baby dead? They said, no, the baby's alive. I said, well, what can I see? No, the baby's having some trouble. We're trying to give her oxygen, trying to get her to breathe. And she said, well, what's going to happen? I said, baby, you may not survive, but you're going to be okay because the baby's out of you. So she grabbed her rosary beads, and she said the rosary, and said, Blessed Mother, Blessed Virgin Mother, you were close to your mother. If you let my baby survive, I'll name her after you, after your mother. And she prayed. And a couple days go by, and the doctors came in and said, Mrs. Massaroni, your daughter looks like she's going to live. She's starting to breathe on her own. And she said, that's great. Oh, by the way, what are you going to call her? And she said, I'm going to call her Anna, after the mother of the Blessed Virgin. Well, Anna did survive. She became very bright. She grew very curious, and she was the daughter that Giuseppina always wanted, because Giuseppina, when she heard her daughter was dying in the hospital, came to see her daughter. And when her daughter woke up from her coma, her red-haired husband there, not nobody, was there, and her mother was there. Because when she thought she was going to lose her daughter, she was going to be there next to her little girl. So she was there, and they became friendly again. And she embraced Tony and says, "You're the husband, you're the father. We gotta live with this. You come on, we'll be a family again." And Giuseppina spent most of her time raising this little girl, Anna. She taught her to read. She taught her how to speak Italian the way Italians are supposed to speak. She taught her how to read Dante. Page by page, she went through the book so that she said everything perfectly in Italian. And the little girl would work in the cigar store after school, and then she'd go to school and she'd be a superstar. So much of a superstar is that she was skipping grades. She was going ahead of the other kids in school. She graduated from classical, and she did very well.